Yes, it's wrong. It was wrong in the website. If you go to Hello, welcome to our member meeting for the Redbud chapter of California Native Plant Society. We are really thrilled to be able to have this meeting and have people attend. And we are going to take care of some self-governance tonight and get through our election. And then we're going to be able to have Shane Hanofee speak to us about the plant families of Plastic Canthus, which is going to be wonderful. He's a field botanist with a vast wealth of knowledge about California native plants and a photographer, and I think you'll love this. So the directions for how to vote, if you're a Redbud member or a CNPS member, are in the chat, and please take a look at those and do vote. I'm sorry, I keep getting messages. The newsletter had the wrong link, and so I keep getting messages from people who say they can't get into the meeting. So I'll be taking care of that in a minute. If you have any questions or subjects you'd like Redbud to be looking into, can you please put notes in the chat, and we can talk about those a little bit later. But I think I'm a little thrown off stride by the problems with the message that was sent out. Okay. Just some background. This is the second of two meetings. We had the nominations at our last meeting, which is about adventures in native gardening. And tonight, we're going to be hearing about native plant families. I'm going to take a quick break on this and be right back. Sorry about that. I'd like to tell you a little bit for those who don't know Redbud. The Redbud chapter has been active in Nevada and Placer County for almost 30 years. We are we've been growing quite a bit lately. We're up to over 400 members. We do field trips. For the past year and a half, almost 2 years, they have been virtual mostly, but we're looking forward to getting into the field soon. Again, with new field trips. We have, our chapter has published 2 guides to the native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers of Nevada and Placer counties, which are cover over 700 native plants of our counties and have lots of information and beautiful photographs. They are great guides to the plants that actually are native to our area. We also have speakers such as the one tonight. We do plant sales. We have workshops, and we have just started a nursery. So we're looking for volunteers in many of these areas. And so if you're interested, send a note to nativeplant.help@redbud-cnps.org, and we'd love to meet you and get you involved. How are we doing on voting, Shane? Are we ready to go with your presentation?
Yeah, I think we're ready to go. I'll put the link one more time in the chat for the people who just joined. For anyone who just joined, you can visit the following link that I'm putting in right now, and please go vote for your chapter officers. It'll just take a quick second.
Thanks, Shane. Okay. Take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Really excited to give this talk for you today. We're going to be talking about the abundant plant families in our 2 counties. Let me get my screen shared here for a second. Okay. So let's get right into it. Here's the tree of life. We're going to be pretty much concentrating on everything from order and below today. Sorry, just give me one more second. I have my Zoom video in the way of my presentation. Okay, now I can see everything. Okay, here we go. We're going to be talking about everything from the order below in this tree of life. We're not going to get too much into species, but I'm going to give you a good idea on using a pattern-based system to recognize some of our most diverse families. And once we get through this presentation, you should be able to recognize at least a family, roughly 50 to 60% of all of the plants that occur in our 2 counties. But before we begin, I do want to give a couple caveats and limitations to what I'm about to talk about. I may give out some quick tips to to help you identify these families. And really, I've only considered as it applies to Nevada and Placer counties. I did not take into consideration the full breadth of the families elsewhere in California or the rest of the world. And also, due to time, of course, we didn't cover all of the families, but like I said, the 10 of the roughly 30 families we're going to talk about today cover about 50% of our vascular plants. And most plant morphology exists as a variation within a handful of characters. So, it's different arrangements of petals and sepals and stamens and pistils and what have you. However, many plants lack these structures or they have specialized parts. And so where specializations crop up, I'm going to try to mention them, describe them a little bit. And for most of them, I've got some nice illustrative pictures as well. Lastly, I'm going to give the taxonomy as it appears in the Jepson Manual online edition. It's kind of the most current reference that we have. I do want to recognize, though, that there is some disagreement in the taxonomic groups and the placements. And so I'm going to be following Jepson for the time being. And lastly, this guide's meant to help you make quick guesses. So essentially, there's a lot of room for error. You shouldn't necessarily take every little tip as a foolproof rule. There's always exceptions. All right, we're going to get right into it. And we're going to talk about first our littlest of plants. It's our bryophytes. These are non-vascular plants, meaning that they have no systems to transport water and nutrients throughout the tissues. They only get water and nutrients as it comes into contact with their tissues. And the first group we're going to talk about are the hornworts. The hornworts are characterized by having long-lasting and indeterminate sporophytes. And so what you're looking at here in this picture, this long little spiky tube thing, that's the sporophyte. That's essentially the reproductive structure. And so when I say it's long-lasting and indeterminate, I'm saying that it will continue to grow so long as environmental conditions allow for it. So that's to contrast with a determinate growth where it grows to a certain size and then just stops. This one will just keep growing so long as it has proper nutrients, proper water, that kind of thing. And it also is characterized by having unicellular rhizoids. Rhizoids is a fancy term. It's basically the equivalent of roots in bryophytes. They aren't true roots in the sense that they don't pick up nutrients and water from the substrate that they're growing in. However, it does work as an anchor, so it holds it in place to the substrate. And so the rhizoids of hornworts are unicellular, so they're made of one elongated cell, each little rhizoid. Now contrast that with our liverworts. These have ephemeral and determinate sporophytes. So the sporophytes don't last too long. If you look at this picture in the center here, we're looking at an Asterella species. This is the sporophyte, and it arises out of this little leafy pad at the bottom, which is called the thallus. And so these grow to a predetermined height and then just stop growing and release their spores. And they don't last very long. Most of the time, they look like these other two leafy liverworts on the side. But they do also have unicellular rhizoids, just like the hornworts. And the last group of bryophytes are the mosses. I think most people know mosses well. We see them everywhere. And they're characterized by having long-lasting but determinate sporophytes, so kind of a mix of the two characters. And notably, they have multicellular rhizoids. So their root-like structures are made of multiple cells. Blasting right along, we've now introduced vascular systems. We're going to talk about the Fern Allies. These are more closely related to ferns than mosses because they have that vasculature, they have that vascular system. However, they're not true ferns, and the difference comes down to the kind of leaf they have, the kind of internal structure of the leaf, and I don't necessarily want to get in the weeds on that because I'm trying to move fast through this. Anyway, the first group are called the club mosses. Don't let the name fool you just because they're called club mosses. They are not mosses. As I said, they are ferns. So for each one of the next slides through the rest of the presentation, the first two bullet points here are going to talk about the number of species that exist in the world, followed by the number of species that exist in our two counties. So I'm not going to be reciting this with every slide, but I just wanted to point that out to you so that you can look at it for yourself. And so we only have one species of club moss in our area. It is actually a ranked rare plant, Lycopodiala inundata. It's only known from 2 locations in all of California, and we are lucky to have one of those locations in Nevada County. And it's characterized by a leafy, branched, and sprawling habit. As you can see here, it's on the bank of this little creek and just kind of growing all over the bank. And every once in a while, it'll send up a branch straight up. And at the tips of those branches will be their spore-bearing structures, which are called strobili. And also to note, they have spores of one type, although that's not something you can really tell just with a hand lens. That's more deep botany at that point. All right, the next group of fern allies are the spike mosses. Once again, for some reason, they gave them the common name moss, even though they're not a moss. You may recognize this plant as a Salaginella. It grows fairly abundantly on the rocky walls of our river canyons. And yes, it's actually a fern. These notably have spores of 2 types, and they have a highly branched and creeping habit. And the difference between these and the club mosses is mainly that the strobili, the spore-bearing structures, are mostly on the side branches rather than at the tips of the branches. And the last group of fern allies are the Quill Warts. In this picture right here, it just kind of looks like a tuft of grass. It doesn't really look like much, but believe it or not, this is also a fern. These also have spores of 2 types, and they have these grass-like leaves, which are cylindrical, and they lead down underneath the ground to a corm, which is basically an underground storage structure. And their strobili, so their spore-bearing surfaces, are at the bases of the leaves, like down right at the base of the plant there. These are members typically of our vernal pool habitats, and they're very easy to miss because, they just kind of look like the fresh new growth of a grass. Digging one up really reveals its true identity. Okay, true ferns now, more or less. We're going to deal with certainly not the lycopods. Talking first about the horsetails, which I found this quite amazing. There's only 15 species of horsetails in the entire world, and most of them are found with broad ranges across the entire globe. We have 4 species, and they're notable for having their leaves in whorls, so essentially arranged in a ring around the stem at different levels and different nodes. Their strobili are this structure here at the top, and they are spike-like, and they occur at the ends of the shoots. And some species, they have separate fertile and infertile shoots, and some only have fertile shoots. What we're looking at here is a fertile shoot because it has the strobili. Other ones are just vegetative. They just, photosynthesize and whatnot. This species we're looking at here actually does have both fertile and infertile shoots. You can see in the background, there's a infertile shoot kind of just starting to grow. But what we're looking at in the foreground here are the fertile shoots. The next group of ferns are the moonwarts. This is one of my favorite groups of plants, period. It's made up informally of 2 genera, the Cypridium and the Botricium. The Botricium in particular there's 6 species reported from our counties, and I say reported in this instance because they are so difficult to identify that I have a strong suspicion that we may have more or less than the number that has been reported. It really requires an expert to be able to identify 2 species. And notably, both of these kinds of ferns, they always have separate fertile and infertile fronds. In this picture here, you can see the green leafy dissected infertile fronds, and then rising from the top are these like lime green structures. These are the fertile fronds, and they have little tiny spore-bearing structures, which kind of look like a cluster of grapes, which leads to the other common name for these, which are the grape ferns. Also really interesting about both of these is that they have a mycorrhizal association. So it's very strange for ferns. Essentially, when a spore germinates, the first little structure that appears will exist several inches down in the soil. And so it can't reach the sunlight. And so it manages to live down there for sometimes several years, in fact, by tapping into the fungal network in the soil and derives its energy from the mushrooms. And then eventually it rises above ground and we get to see it. But there's no telling how many exist below ground. Okay, and these are the true ferns. And they come in so many different shapes and sizes. occupy so many different habitats. We have them in wet areas, in dry areas. The one in the top photo is actually an aquatic fern, which floats on the surface of slow-moving streams and lakes. But nonetheless, it is a fern. Some of these true ferns also have separate fertile and infertile fronds. And a really important structure for identifying ferns is called the sori. And it's essentially a round or oblong organelle on the underside of the leaves typically, and that's where the spores are born. So if we go back and get rid of my overlay here, we can see on the left side, this is a sorus right here. Sorus is the singular for sori, which is plural. And this one is of a Polypodium species. And then as well over here, we have a Polystichum species, and these are a line of sori. The other important structure is called an indusia, and there's three different groups of indusiate ferns, and these are ones with a true indusia, those with a false indusia, and those with no indusia at all. So if we look back here at our Polystichum again, we can see this like papery membranous covering on top of the sorus. That is the indusium right there. And so the shape of that, the margin of it, whether it's toothed or fringed, and where it attaches to the sori can be really helpful in identifying ferns. And back on the Polypodium over here, we can see it has no covering, it has no indusia whatsoever. So that is one of the non-indusiate ferns. And then switching back over to the right side, both on the top and the bottom, we have two examples of ferns with a false indusia. A false indusia is essentially a part of the leaf which folds over the sori and protects the spores. And essentially that's the purpose of an indusia, whether it's a true indusia or a false indusia, is to protect the developing spores. So yeah, next time you see a maidenhair fern, flip over one of the fronds and you should see the edge of the leaf is actually folded over. And if you unfold it, you'll see the sori beneath it.
Wow.
All right, so next we have the gymnosperms. At a certain point, plants evolved the seeds, essentially. That's the big development here. We went from germinating from spores to essentially crafting a more or less hardened structure with all of the nutrients encased within it so that the seeds could lay in wait for conditions to be perfect to germinate. And thus the gymnosperms evolved. The first family of gymnosperms we're going to talk about is Pinaceae. And this includes Abies, our firs, Pinus, our pines, Pseudotsuga, which is our Douglas fir, and Tsuga, which is the hemlocks. And these are characterized by having needle-like leaves. Just think of a pine needle. And also having a cone scale bract present, which it's really easy to see that on the Douglas fir, which has these little mouse tail bracts in here. But in fact, all of the members of this family have a little bract. In fact, in the firs, it's so deeply encased in the cone that you can barely see it unless you break open the cone and really look for it. But nonetheless, it's there. Also notable that the male cones, these are all the female cones, by the way, that we're looking at. Those are the ones that produce the seeds. All the male cones will show up on new growth. And lastly, all of the cones are woody in character. So to contrast that, we have the Cupressaceae. This is made up of our Caliscedrus, that's the incense cedar, Hesperocyparis, those are our cypress, Juniperus, which is pretty obviously the junipers, and Sequoiadendron, the giant sequoia, which we're super lucky to have it just barely make it into our chapter area down in Placer County. And these ones, rather than just having needle-like leaves, can have needle-like leaves, but they may also have awl or scale-like leaves. And in fact, I think the awl and scale-like leaves are far more common, at least in our area. Now, these cones, they do have cones, do not have those bracts. And the male cones will also occur on the new growth, so it shares that in common with the pine family. However, the cones may be woody or fleshy in the case of Juniperus here, which these little, what they call juniper berries, those are actually cones. They're just on the fleshy side. And our last group of gymnosperms today is the Taxaceae. This is made of two species, Torreya californica and Taxus brevifolia. And both of these are relatively uncommon plants. They both have needle-like leaves, and they both have fleshy cones. So they're never woody, they're always fleshy. Here's the fruit of the torreya, the California nutmeg. And with a fleshy fruit, it also doesn't have bracts. And noticeably, the male cones, rather than on the new growth, are actually in the leaf axils. And so this is a male cone, as shown on a taxus right here. And it's growing right out of the space where the leaf and the stem meets. That's what we call the axil. And these are the little pollen-bearing structures right here. I believe in pines, they also call this a strobili. So yeah, just the same term. Okay, with that, we move on to flowers. Flowering plants obviously make up the vast majority of the plant life in our region on Earth at large. And so I wanted to just give a small overview of some of the morphology of your typical flower. Obviously, there's much variation on this theme, but there's certain words here that I'm going to use quite a bit when describing the families to come. And so I just want to point out, first of all, that we have the sepals, which one sepal, and all together they are referred to as the calyx. And then we have the petals, which one is called the petal, altogether they're called the corolla, and both of those together are referred to as a perianth. From there, we have the male and the female parts, and sometimes these occur on the same flower, and sometimes they occur on separate flowers. But in any case, the male part are the stamen, which is made of two parts, which is the filament, this long tube right here, and at the top is the anther, and the anthers contain the pollen and release them. And compare that with the pistil, that's the female part here, where we have the ovary at the bottom. Above that is a tube called the style, and then the receptive part where the pollen will land and actually pollinate the flower, that's called the stigma. And so now that you have a little overview of flowers, let's talk about some of the plants which have them. Starting with a really interesting group called the Magnoliids. These are basal angiosperms. And so what I mean when I say that is that essentially on the evolutionary tree, they split off and started evolving separately from all other flowering plants very early on. So right after flowering plants developed. And so one lineage became the Magnoliids, and the other lineage became every other flowering plant in the world. They do have true flowers, but at the same time, they have certain anatomical similarities to Gymnosperms. It's really noticeable if you look at the stamens, I would say. And if you want a good example to just look at on your own, in the spring, when we have our California bay, which is one of the plants we're going to talk about here, which is a Magnoliid, if you go look at the flowers of California bay really close, you'll see that the stamens are, I've used the term bear club-like. They're really fat and wide and kind of scale-like. And that's very similar to the pollen-bearing structures of Gymnosperms and sort of dissimilar to other angiosperms. However, these do have flower parts in multiples of 3, which is really interesting too, because that's sort of a feature we refer to as belonging to the monocots a lot, which we're going to talk about the monocots in a second here. So the Magnoliids are essentially this weird menagerie of different forms. They also have the branching leaf venation of the eudicots. And some Magnoliids you probably have heard of before are the nutmeg, avocado, magnolias, and cinnamon, as well as the 3 species that we have in our area. Each one represented, it's the sole species in its family in our area. So starting with the Cali Canthaceae, which has Cali Canthus occidentalis, our spice bush, our wonderful spice bush. These are pretty, I would say, self-explanatory. If you see this flower, really don't have another flower that looks like it. It's made up of numerous, so I said multiples of 3, and to be honest, I'm not sure. I've never counted the tepals of a spice bush to see if it actually does come in multiples of 3, and I feel like there's enough chance for error where a teepal has fallen off or something that you might not ever really know. But supposedly it comes in multiples of 3, arranged in spirals. And I should define the word tepal as well. A tepal is essentially a word for a petal and or sepal, which are colored exactly the same. And it would be really hard for you to tell them apart except for to look at the point of attachment where they attach to the stem, because the sepals will always be attached below the petals. So in the cases where it all just kind of looks the same, we would call them tepals, and it's a really common term used in the monocot family, which we'll talk about. And also, if you don't have any flowers, just look for their really distinctive seed pods here. They persist on the plants for quite some time and really make it stand out. Okay, and here's our California Bay, which I talked a bit earlier about. You can see in this picture of the flowers, if you squint maybe, that these anthers are widened, those bear club anthers. And again, really easy, really distinct plant, simply if you just smell the leaves. Very aromatic, and obviously can be used in cooking. And lastly, this is their fruit, which is technically a berry, and it's essentially a fleshy fruit with a single pit inside. And our last Magnoliid is our beautiful Dutchman's pipe in the Aristolochiaceae. It's our only species of in this family, and as you may be familiar, it's got a vining habit and these very distinctive curved flowers. The seeds are born in capsules, which dehisce, or essentially dehisce just means like break apart, open up, and spill out the seeds. All right, and now we're going to talk about monocots. I said earlier that we were going to touch on orders a little bit. And so this is my slide here where I wanted to talk a little bit about the orders of monocots. We have 4 orders of monocots in our counties, and we will be talking about 3 today. And I did include a little picture of a Damasonium californicum, which is a member of the 4th order that we will not be talking about today. It's made of like water plantains and related species. But we are going to talk about the Poales, which include our grasses, sedges, rushes, and cattails. We will talk about Lily Allies, which have very showy flower. It gets its name from lilies essentially, and the Asparagales, which is practically everything else. There's 14 families within the order of Asparagales, although this is a very controversial number, though a lot of people would disagree with that number, and there's so many different descriptions of this order. So I'm going with what's in Jepson. And both the Lily Allies and Asparagales have fairly showy flowers, and one of the main differences is that the nectaries, so these are essentially structures which produce like a sugary substance to attract their insect pollinators. Their nectaries are typically on different parts. With the Lily Allies, the nectaries are on the tepals, so on the petals and the sepals. And with the Asparagales, they're typically on the ovaries. So getting right into the Poales, we'll talk about our first family. It's Poaceae, a massive, absolutely massive family. These are our grasses. We have 250 species in our 2 counties, counting the non-natives, which basically makes it the 2nd largest family in the entire 2 counties. And notably, grasses have hollow stems, except at the nodes. So at the point where the leaves arise, that part will be solid, but otherwise the stems will be hollow. They have alternate leaves, which means they come out from they alternate up the stem. So one on one side. Let's see if I can demonstrate that. I didn't put a really good picture here, but if we look at this one stem right here, this Danthonia, you'd have a leaf coming off to the left here, and then the next node, it would go off to the right. And I reversed my directions, but you get the idea. And the leaves are in 2 ranks. So essentially they occur on those opposite sides of the stem, but alternating up the stem as they arise out. I'm pretty sure I could have said that more confusingly. Anyway, moving on to the Cyperaceae. These are our sedges, but also our bulrushes, our nut sedges, and our spike rushes. And I don't know why, but for some reason, someone decided to give bulrushes and spike rushes the name rush in there, even though they're in the sedge family and not in the rush family. So they don't make it easy on us, but we manage. So the stems are not hollow, but rather solid or perhaps pithy, with a foam-like substance, or they're not absolutely solid through, and often triangular at cross-section. The leaves, rather than being alternate, are arranged spirally up the stem in 3 ranks, rather than 2. And when you're dealing with the Carex species, which are our true sedges, in particular, you really want to take note of a structure called the perigynia. And that is showcased in this upper photo right here. You see these fuzzy bits right here. The perigynia, or sometimes called the peri for short, is essentially an encasing around the seed of the carex, and the shape of it, whether it's hairy or not, the venation, it's the single most important character when trying to ID a sedge. So oftentimes, if you want to know what sedge you have in your meadow at home or what have you, you need to wait until there are fruits. The flowers, like these flowers over here, give you some valuable information, but really, if you want to get it down to species, you're going to need to wait for those seeds to start developing. And so inside these is an achene, is the type of seed technically. It's essentially a dry, indehiscent seed, so it doesn't break apart. It's just the full dry seed inside there. Next family is Juncaceae. These are our rushes. So made of 2 genera in our area, Juncus and Lusula. Juncus are often associated with wetlands, and Lusula more associated with woodlands and dry areas, but plenty of Juncus also grow in dry areas as well. I'm not aware of any Lusula that have an affinity for wet areas, except for by chance maybe. But this is a pretty difficult group to work with, but I'll give you a couple things to note about them: that their stems are round and solid or pithy, that their leaves are alternate like the grasses, but they are 3-ranked like the sedges. And this bottom picture right here of this dark colored flower, and you have the male parts and then the long stigma here, lobed stigma. This is a very typical flower form for many Juncus. So if you see something that looks like this, you can pretty much guarantee you have a Juncus or a Lusula, but there is some variation, like the flowers above it. There's just, I don't know, there's probably 30 species in our 2 counties which have flowers that look exactly like this, and it's really tiny details that you have to look at to tease out what species you're looking at. Okay, moving on to Liliales. Aren't they gorgeous? Some of our most showy flowers. Our Mariposa lilies are in this order, our fawn lilies are in this order, our fritillaries, and of course our lilies. These are typically have large showy flowers with 1 style in the center. So if we look at this lily on the side here, that's our 1 style coming out of the flower. They're often arising from a bulb, but every so often they are rhizomatous. I know some lilies can be rhizomatous, and the fruit is either a capsule or a berry. So either a sort of hard, dry fruit that opens up and spills out the seed, or a fleshy fruit with the seeds inside of it. Next is the Melanthiaceae. Also, I mean, this whole order just has some gorgeous flowers. They're typically in panicles or racemes. And so we have an example of each right here, the corn lily right here, the veratrum. This right here is a raceme. And so you essentially have multiple flowers on each branch of the branching inflorescence here. And over here is a panicle where you have a branching inflorescence as well, but there's only 1 flower per branch. That's the difference between a panicle and a raceme. But also you may have just a single flower, as is the case with the trillium, which also belong to this family. Notably, they have 3 styles instead of 1. So that's one way you can tell the 2 families apart. They also come from a bulb or a rhizome, and their fruit will always be a capsule, never a berry. And the last one, which I included despite the fact that this family only has 1 representative in our area, and it's relatively uncommon. I just adore it so much, and I think it's really interesting that it's a vining monocot that can, I've seen vines of this that are 40, 50 feet tall up into the tree canopies, and yet it's a monocot. It's, more closely related to like a lily than a grape, like you might think. And you can see it's got the parallel veins like a monocot. This is Smilax Californica. And you'll note it also has prickles on the stems. This species, Smilax Californica, has prickles on the stems. There is a rare species further north that has no prickles on the stems. This one, the stigma, rather than 1 or 3, it's absent, or in other members of this family, and occasionally this one, it's much reduced. So you essentially wouldn't be able to even recognize there being a style there at all. It would just look like the stigma is sitting directly on top of the ovary. These are rhizomatous, and so they'll spread underground, and the fruit's a berry. So moving on to the next order here is the Asparagales. And we're going to start with a family, which I think is super easy to recognize to family and then gets pretty difficult to recognize to species pretty fast. And that's the Alliaceae. Of our 17 species in this family, they are all in the genus Allium. These are all onions, and they are characterized by their strong onion odor. So if you see a plant that you think is an onion and you break a little bit of the leaf and you get that strong onion odor, chances are you have an onion. And if it doesn't have the onion odor, it's probably one of the ones we're going to get into in a second. Notably is superior. And so that's a new term, so I'll define it real quick. Think about where the sepals and the petals attach to the stem. The ovary will either be above that point of attachment, in which case that's a superior ovary. That's what we're looking at here, which you can kind of make out in this photo right here. Or the ovary can be inferior, in which case it is attached below the point of the petals and the sepals. And I'm going to show you an inferior ovary in a second. I should also say that ovaries can sometimes be partially inferior or superior. So they'll be like the point of attachment is kind of right in the middle of the ovary. They don't make it easy on us, that's for sure. And I just want to mention real quick that the 2 most important structures in IDing onions and why I say it's difficult, are the outer bulb coat cells and the ovary crests. So if we look down inside this little tiny flower and we see the ovary, on these ovaries, there may or may not be a little tiny bump. And that's what we refer to as the ovary crest. And its shape, its position, whether it's there or not, and the number of them are all important characters on how to identify onions. And then in this not so great picture in the center here, we are seeing the outer bulb coat cells. This is what's referred to as wishbone cells. I think there's a fancy word for it too, but it escapes me at the moment. And essentially how they have these wavy patterns to each of the cells. And this is just on the outside. If we look at the second layer in on this same exact onion, you can see the cells look very, very different. They're very rectangular rather than this wishbone shape. So if you want to ID an onion and you actually want to key it out, unfortunately, you have to dig it up. You have to get a hand lens and you have to look at these little tiny cells on the outer bulb coat and hope that you didn't remove the outer bulb coat in the process of digging it up. So yeah, difficult group. All right, next we're going to talk about Thymidacea. I think I have a typo there. I think it's supposed to be Thymidacea anyway. These are some of our most famous wildflowers. We have our Brodia, we have our Dichelostoma, our Tritolea, the new genus Dipterostemen, which is the new name for the blue dicks, and the Muilla, which if you notice is actually allium backwards, and that's not a coincidence. That's this this white flowered plant right here, and it does kind of look like an onion, so they just decided to give it sort of the cheeky name of Muilla. All of these ones may look like onions, and I have definitely seen people mistake these for onions before. However, they all lack the onion smell. So it's pretty easy to tell that it's not an onion at the very least. These also have a superior ovary, and they arise from a corm rather than a bulb, typically. And the most important structure for this family are the stamens. Remember, that's the male part, and also the staminodes. And so I can show you a staminode right here on this Brodia. That's this little white piece sticking up on the side. On this Dipterostemen, that's the curved staminode right here. On this Dichelostoma, there's your staminode, that little round part right there. And a staminode is essentially it's like a stamen, but it has no anther. It's like a widened filament infertile stamen, essentially. And for instance, in the Brodia, it's really important to pay attention to those staminodes because the position in the flower, their shape, whether they're curved or not, all really important. There's this dichelostoma right here. There's a plant that looks exactly like this, except instead of a rounded tip to the staminode right here, it would be forked and pointed. And so that's how you can tell the difference between two different species. So you want to get really far inside of your Brodia and your dichelostoma and whatnot. But notably, a lot of the Tritolea don't even have staminodes. So in that case, it's the stamens that's really important. The next one is the Iridaceae. Contains our irises and the Sisyrinchium, the blue-eyed grasses. Notably, in this family, they have inferior ovaries. So if we look on the right side and we look at this iris, we can see the petals and the sepals attached. And then this structure below the point of attachment is the inferior ovary.
Oh my God. And then we have the blue grass.
Give me 1 second here. I'm gonna stop sharing for 1 second. I just want to make sure everyone's muted. Okay, back to it. So yeah, the blue-eyed grass as well. If you look down into the flower, you see there's no ovary sitting on top of these. The ovary is actually below the point of attachment. So inferior ovaries. They arise from a corm or occasionally a rhizome. And if you remember back to my slide about the orders, and I said that the Asparagales have their nectaries on the ovary rather than on the tepals. Have you ever looked at an iris and you flip it over and you see that there's a mass of ants on the bottom of the flower? Well, those ants are going ham on the ovary, well, specifically on the nectary that's on the ovary. And so I got a nice little picture here showing the ants collecting their nectar from the ovary of this iris species here. All right, next is Agaveaceae. We only have 5 species in our counties, but they're some of our most beautiful and memorable. So I wanted to touch on them real quick. And that's our Camassia or Camosyles, the Chlorogalum, the soap lilies, the soap plants, and the Hestingsia, which is fairly uncommon in our area. But if you go further north into like Plumas National Forest, you can find some really nice stands of it. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous plant. All of ours are herbaceous. So there are members of this family like the agave, which tend to get kind of woody, but all of ours are very, very herby. And they all rise from bulbs, at least our genera in our counties. And the flowers are in racemes or panicles, kind of like the Melianthaceae, but all of their leaves are basal. And so think about, I'm sure most people in attendance have experience with a soap plant. You have your ring of leaves down at the base of the plant, and then you have this long, long stem and stalk with all the flowers on it, but there are no leaves on that stem and stalk. So when all of the leaves are coming out of the bottom of the plant, we call that basal leaves, and the leaves that grow along the stalk, we call those colline leaves. And so in our members of Agaveaceae, all of the leaves are basal. They're all at the base of the plant. And the last group we're going to talk about are our beautiful, beautiful orchids. We're going to talk very quickly because I could probably spend an hour alone talking about orchids, and I don't want to subject you to that. So instead, I'm going to show you these beautiful pictures and just mention that these also, like the ferns, have mycorrhizal associations, which allows them to be lacking in chlorophyll. So like this Corolla rhiza in the center here has no green, has no chlorophyll, it can't make its own food. So instead it relies on its fungal associate in order to get all of its nutrients. And orchids also, they have specialized pollination strategies and specialized flower morphologies. And again, I just decided to gloss over it because it gets fairly complex, and I would talk for way too long about it. Hopefully we'll have a program soon on orchids especially. Okay, and that ends the monocots. But before we get into the eudicots, we're going to take a little pit stop in the Ceratophyllales, which is an order containing one living genus, one family, one genus, the Ceratophyllum. There were 3 others, but they are long extinct. And the reason why we're talking about this now is because this order split off from all other plants sometime after the monocots. So the monocots split off from all of the eudicots, and then at some point, the Ceratophyllales split off as well, and started evolving down its own course, and then everything else became the eudicots. And I just wanted to touch on it because it's an awfully pretty native plant. We only have the 1 species. It is aquatic. It lives literally free floating in water. It completely lacks roots. You will never find this with roots. It just doesn't have them. Leaves are in whorls. So again, they're in a ring around the stem at various nodes. And this kind of superficially resembles other aquatic plants with whorled leaves, like our Myriophyllum, for instance. But those plants, even though you might find it floating free, having broken off from its plant, technically the mother plant always has roots. So that's how these are different. They just decided through evolutionary processes, we don't need roots anymore. And also this plant is used in aquariums, so people put it in their fish tanks. All right, we've hit the mother load now. We're on the eudicots. This term I want to talk about real quick is eudicot. I think a lot of people make the split between monocots and dicots. However, we now use the term eudicots. And the reason for that is the word dicot just essentially referred to the number of cotyledons, or the number of seed leaves. So there were 2 seed leaves for everything included in the dicot, and there was 1 monocot, 1 cotyledon for everything in the monocots. But after genetic testing started coming out, they realized that, hey, the Magnoliids, which we covered earlier, they have 2 seed leaves, but they separated way before the monocots did. So this group that we formed, called the dicots, is unnatural, essentially. It doesn't represent the true evolutionary relationships. And so now scientists use this term eudicots to separate out the Magnoliids from the rest of the flowering plants. All right, so let's get into it. We're going to start with Apiaceae. That's the carrot family. I think a lot of people are familiar with this family in one way or another, but some of the things you want to look for as far as pattern recognition is that the flowers are going to occur in what's called a compound umbel. And so an umbel is essentially a center point, which then has little stalks or stems coming off of it. And then the flowers would be at the ends of those. So if we look at, like, let's say this top picture right here, each one of these little circles is an umbel. There's a center point, and then all of these flowers are extending out from that center point. But when we say a compound umbel, we're talking about the fact that below these flowers right here, there's another center point, and then branches coming off of that, and then it umbels again. So we have one umbel with the point here, which extends to here, and then there's another umbel right here. And you can see in all of these pictures, it's the same pattern each time. We have a center point right here on this sanicula. It branches off, and then there's another center point, and then another umbel of flowers. And the same deal goes with all of these other carrot family members. That's a compound umbel. Many of these plants have distinct odors. Think of parsley or celery or cilantro. These are all members of this family. Well, our native plants also typically have really distinct odors. Sometimes you can even tell the genus you're looking at by the kind of smell it has, and it must have something to do with like the chemical components within the leaves or something like that. Also, a lot of these plants have highly dissected leaves. They almost look like ferns. Like if there's no flowers on them, you might think it was a fern. That's how dissected they are. And all of their flowers will have 5 petals. They'll have 5 stamens. But as you can see in the upper right picture right here, due to the shape of these flowers, sometimes that can be really hard to pick out that there's actually 5 petals in there and actually 5 stamens. You really do need a hand lens. Much easier to tell, however, is the fact that it has 2 styles, which on this photo on the upper left, you can really see the 2 styles coming off of these developing seeds right here. They kind of look like a weird antenna coming off of the seeds. Those are the 2 styles. So yeah, those are the characters of the carrot family. Okay, talk about another family that I could probably go on for multiple hours about, but I'm going to try to condense it as best as I can. This is the largest family of plants in the world. It is similarly the largest family of plants in our area. It's the Asteraceae, the sunflower family, the composites. And just look at this this diversity here. I mean, I had to narrow down 400 species into like a dozen pictures, so it was very difficult to choose what to show off. And a lot of writing to get across as well. So the composite family, the sunflower family, is characterized by its composite inflorescence, which resembles a flower. And so if we look up here, this is a woolly sunflower. This looks like a flower, but it's actually comprised of many, many, many flowers. Typically, this is like your daisy form, essentially. We would call this a radiate head. And it's made of two different kinds of flowers. We have the ones that look like petals are actually whole entire flowers in and of themselves, and that's called a ray flower. And in the center, we have these little tiny tubular flowers, and each one of those is a complete flower as well, and that's called a disc flower. And so the whole thing together, because it looks like a flower, but it's actually made, it's not like a true flower, there's a special term for that. It's called a pseudanthia, which I really like that term, so I try to sneak it in wherever I can. There are four main kinds of aster family flowers. There's the discoid heads, the radiate heads, the disciform heads, and the ligulate heads. And so if we go back to our photos for a second, I'm going to show you examples of each of those. We talked about, first of all, our radiate head in this woolly sunflower right here. That's the one that has ray flowers and disc flowers, and they're arranged spirally, and it's your very typical like daisy or sunflower form. But then we have this Malacothrix right here, or think of another example that has a similar flower. Think of a dandelion. This is called a ligulate head, and each one of these little strap-shaped bits right here is a single flower. This is a head of multiple flowers, and this flower is called a ligule, or at least this part of it is called a ligule. And then we'll move over here to, this is a Canactus species, and you'll notice it looks like it's made of all disc flowers, and there are no ray flowers coming out. And that's the definition of a discoid head. So essentially we have a radiate head right here, ray flowers and disc flowers. We have a ligulate head, which is basically all ray flowers and no disc flowers. And then we have a discoid head, which is essentially all disc flowers and no ray flowers. But I also mentioned a fourth form, and that's called disciform. And this little plant in the bottom left is our Q-tips, our Micropost Californicus. This is technically a disciform head, and it's the only one I have in here, which is disciform, although because of these tomentose hairs, you can't really see what's happening here, but I will just describe it to you. Essentially, a disciform head is one where it has ray flowers, but they're very, very small and they're much reduced, and so it looks like a discoid head. And so really, to be able to tell the difference between a discoid head and a disciform head, you're getting out your hand lens, you're dissecting a flower, and in many cases, you're just taking an expert's word for it because they're so hard to work with and figure out. So a couple specialized terms in the sunflower family. We have the receptacle. So the receptacle is the structure to which individual flowers are attached. So if we imagined, we'll take this this Canactus again. If we imagined we removed all of the flowers, and then at the base here where all the flowers are attached is a structure called a receptacle. And maybe you've seen like a dandelion where it's gone to seed and you've blown off all of the seeds off and you see this little disc below and it's kind of pockmarked where all the seeds were once attached. That's a perfect example of a receptacle. The next specialized term is called the palea, and it's the name given to a bracteolate that is growing between flowers and attached to the receptacle. So again, going back to our photos, I don't have any good photos of a palea, unfortunately, but if we imagine the receptacle and the seed is attached to it, in between the seeds will be these little strap-shaped bracts, which don't ever really get bigger than the disc flowers. But their presence or absence within the flower there can be really important. If you ever try to key something to the genus in this family, it's going to ask you about that structure a lot. So I thought it was good to define. And the last part well, second to last part, I guess, is the pappus, which may be present or absent. This is a structure which aids in seed dispersal, and it may be feathery, papery, or scale-like. I do have a good photo of that right here. We can see these seeds of an Agaceras species, and this little feathery bit at the end, that's the pappus. And so just like a dandelion fluff, that's anytime you're looking at a dandelion, you're looking at the pappus there. And not all sunflower family plants have this long stalk with the pappus at the end. Sometimes it's attached right to the top of the seed. Sometimes it's very, very, very small. And I don't even know what purpose it might. I mean, technically it helps disperse the seed further, but it's certainly not going to help it catch the wind much in the same way as like a dandelion seed does. Nonetheless, it's there. And the last term we're going to talk about is a phyllory. Phyllories are super important when identifying members of this family. In fact, if you were to send me a picture of this woolly sunflower right here, and you asked me what this plant was, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you. There are like hundreds of plants which look like this. But if you turned it and you showed it on its side, like this Canactus here, I could tell you that it was a woolly sunflower. These are the phyllories right here. It's these green bracts that enclose the flower. And they may be in a single series, or like this one, they may be attached in several different series where they kind of wrap up the entire flower head right there. Or we can look over here at this Cirsium species, and we can see the phyllories are super spiky. And over here on this Wyethia, behind this flower head, we can see the phyllories just peeking out. They're very leafy in this species right here. And so, yeah, phyllories are super important. If you want someone to identify a sunflower family plant and you don't include a picture which looks like this and shows the side of the flower, you will probably be out of luck. And just lastly to mention, there's many, many tribes within the sunflower family, which makes it a little easier to recognize them. All right, let's move on. Another family I think a lot of people are somewhat familiar with, it's the Brassicaceae, the mustard family. Super diverse. We have 125 taxa and subtaxa. At this point, I kind of stopped trying to tease out what was a species and what was a subspecies and variety, and just counted them all in that number there. Notably, members of this family have 4 petals. Take a look at this erythmium right here. We got 4 petals, and they're typically arranged either in an X or like an H, with like, you know, one petal coming out this way, one petal coming out that way, and opposite on the opposite side. And they have 6 stamens. Often cases, it has 4 long stamens and 2 short stamens. So if you want to try to count the stamens, you're going to want to pull apart a flower to make sure that you see those 2 short ones in there. And they're also characterized by their indeterminate inflorescences. So this is that term we used back when we were talking about the hornworts. Essentially, what this means in this case is that the flowers, like take this Bochara species right here, here are the flowers at the tips of the branches, and it will grow and grow and grow. And you can see at the flowers at the bottom have seeds starting to form. And then this one is just a different stalk, but up at the top of this stalk, you'd have the same scene as down here. The flowers are up at the top, and they're in gradually more developed as it goes down. And so the seed pods that are at the bottom were the first flowers to bloom. And it just constantly grows and grows and grows until it runs out of food, it runs out of water, it gets too hot. There's some sort of environmental condition which causes it to finally stop flowering. And like, for instance, in my garden, I grow radishes, which is another member of this family. And if I continue to give them water, they will just keep growing the entire season long and just keep spitting out flowers and seed pods. It's pretty fascinating. And speaking of seed pods, all of the members of this family enclose their seeds in various kinds of pods and capsules and siliques. And silique is the word for this kind of fruit right here in this Bochara, this like long, skinny pod, essentially. Also, our jewel flowers have something similar. They also have a silique. But some of the pods are really ornate, like this French pod right here, which a lot of people never notice it in flower, but then when it has the seed pods out, you sure do notice it. Okay, here's the Boraginaceae family. I want to ask you, do you see any patterns here? We'll just look at this diversity of borage family ferns. And I think if you stared at this long enough, you'd start to see some things which stand out and are telltale for this family. Well, I'll just go ahead and tell you. Number one, a lot of these plants are stiff, hairy. I mean, look at this Amsynchia right here. You can see these hairs sticking out. If you were to touch this, it's very scratchy and rough. Certain plants like the Phacelia can actually give you a contact dermatitis, especially if you have sensitive skin. So yeah, those hairs can even be irritating sometimes. Very common in this family is what's called a scorpioid inflorescence. And this picture of the Amsynchia, once again, illustrates this very clearly. It's this curly Q shape, which kind of looks like a scorpion's tail, which is how you can remember scorpioid. So many plants in this family display this kind of inflorescence. It's not always the case, like these 5-spot down here don't have scorpioid inflorescences, but in certain ones, the popcorn flowers, the Amsynchias, Draperia, even if you look at this right here, the Yerba Santa, it's kind of a loose scorpioid inflorescence, but nonetheless, it's doing the same thing. And also, if you notice, this is another indeterminate inflorescence, but it's like, actually, I think that's the wrong term, and I can't remember what the correct term is because it's like the opposite of an indeterminate inflorescence, where the new flowers. Nope, I confused myself. It is an indeterminate inflorescence. You have the new flowers at the end, and then seeds are already forming down here at the base. Sorry about that. Got turned around in my own head. All right, another couple things are the fused 5 petals. Again, fused and 5 petals, fused and 5 petals. That is a borage family thing. There's also 5 stamens in there, which you can kind of make out at the top of this Phacelia picture right here. You got the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you got a 2-parted style right here, kind of making it look like there might be more than 5. Also, the seeds in this family are nutlets, and they often have burrs. I've got 2 examples right here. Here is a gorgeous nutlet of a popcorn flower, and these are the burrs that I referred to. And over here is a Hakelia seed. They call them stick seeds, and that's because on each one of these spines, there are little burrs, and in both cases, those burrs allow the seeds to attach to animal fur and help the seeds get transported far and wide. Now, I told you all about the Boraginaceae family, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that this family is going to be undergoing a major revision in about a month's time. The Jepson manual is going to be revised. They're going to split this family up. The Yerba Santa is going to be moved into a new family called Nemaceae with another genus we have called Nama. That's going to be in its own family. I think if I remember correctly, like Phacelia is going to be put back in Hydrophalaceae, which was a family that existed before. It was at one point Hydrophalaceae and Boraginaceae were separate. They lumped them together, and unfortunately now they're going to split them back out again. So, you know, it never ends, folks. Okay, moving on. We're going to talk about the Ericaceae, the blueberry family. Another amazing family filled with gorgeous plants. I think many people love the rhododendron. People love our manzanitas, our snow plant. These are all members of the blueberry family. And we can start to see some patterns peeking out at us, even just looking at these couple of photos. So in this family, we have mostly shrubs, not all of them, but a lot of shrubs, some trees, just a lot of woody plants for whatever reason. They also have alternate leaves. And I think that that's most noticeable when you're looking at a plant, which you think might be a manzanita, but it has opposite leaves. And in that case, you're probably looking at a silk tassel, because the two look very, very, very similar, especially when there's no flowers on either. But you can tell that them apart because manzanita has alternate leaves, silk tassel has opposite leaves. Often in this family, we're going to have bell-shaped flowers. That's here in the Sierra Laurel. That's the same on this madrone, the manzanita, even loosely so on the moss heather, and kind of bell flowers on the pine drops as well. So that's a very common thing. Although as the rhododendron and this Kalmia show, it's not necessarily the case. It's just a pattern. A lot of these plants have an affinity for nutrient-poor and acidic soils, and that's why we have such a grand diversity here, is because our soils are typically, in a lot of cases, very acidic, ode to the pine, or it's either because of the pine or in spite of the pine. We have acidic soils. And so there's a lot of places, especially at the higher elevations, which are just like Ericaceae party. You know, there's the entire understory is just filled with members of this family of different shapes and sizes. And it's fantastic. Another group, which is split into many tribes. One tribe I would like to talk about real quick is represented by these 3 species in the lower right. These are our monotropoids. These are a clade of plants within the blueberry family that have mycorrhizal associations and as such have lost their chlorophyll. And so they live entirely parasitic on the fungi. We have the fringe pine sap, the snow plant, the pine drops, all members of the blueberry family. And you might even be aware of a plant which occurs in California only in the farthest northwest corner called Indian pipe, and it's actually quite abundant on the East Coast and up in Canada. Also in the blueberry family and in this monotropoid group, they're fascinating parasitic plants which have an inseparable bond with soil fungi. Although I should mention that most members of this family have some sort of mycorrhizal association. In fact, there's specialized mycorrhizae that only associate with members of this family. I think they're called like ericaceous mycorrhizae or something. And certainly the mushroom flora that comes up underneath, say, in a big stand of madrone is way different than anything else that will come up under our pines or our oaks or what have you. And lastly, I just want to say that many of these plants have edible berries for fruit, like our viciniums, our blueberries, and our madrones or manzanitas. But other ones, like the rhododendron, for instance, have capsules. So they have hard fruits with seeds inside that you don't want to be eaten. Okay, next big family is the pea family, the Fabaceae. Moving right along, a lot of the plants of this family have pinnate leaves, pinnately compound leaves. And so think about like vetch. I think probably most people know what a vetch leaf looks like, where you have a central stalk and then all these little leaflets on the side. And that's actually considered one leaf, and those little leaves on the sides are leaflets. And so we'd call those, pinnately compound leaves. But sometimes members of this family have palmate leaves, think of a lupin leaf, or trifoliate leaves, like a clover, or sometimes it's completely off the wall, like a redbud. Redbud has a very atypical leaf for a pea family member, but nonetheless, it's in that family. Also notably, the seeds are contained in pods, like this astragalus pod right here. Or think about right now, I'm sure if you have a redbud in your yard, it's absolutely laden with the very papery pods of the redbud tree. Members of this family have really distinct flowers, and we're going to use this lathyrus to demonstrate it. There are 5 petals, and they have specialized names. At the top here, you have one really big petal, and it's called the banner. And then on the side, which is kind of reduced in this species, on the side, you have 2 petals on either side. And these are called the wings. And then at the bottom, you have this pointy petal, typically fused. So this is actually 2 petals that are fused into one, and we call both together the keel. And so to zoom down and look at this, wow, I'm spacing on the name right here. Not Hakelia. Hosakia, thank you. Just to explain why that happened, there's Horkelia, Hakelia, and Hosakia, and every time in my brain they get all screwed up. But anyway, this is Hosakia, and it also shows the same kind of pattern. You have the banner in the back here, you have the 2 wings on either side, and you have the pointed keel at the base. It's a very pea family thing, and even to look at this clover, it's a miniaturized version of the same thing with the banner, the keel, and the wings. And again, when families are big, taxonomists like to split them up into these tribes, which may or may not be official. And in this case, this is another one of those where the mimosas and the brooms and the clovers and the trefoils and the peas are all split out into different tribes to make things a little easier. Okay, moving on to the mint family now. I think the most notable thing about the mint family is very obviously the smells, the aromas, the odors. Most of the members of this family smell intoxicating, and that's due to the fact that they contain volatile oils. Now, that's a tendency. This little purple flower up here, this Scutellaria, this species specifically doesn't have any smell to speak of, but most of these other ones smell extremely pungent. I mean, coyote mint is one of my favorite smells. This blue curls right here, I mean, vinegar weed, then most people either love or hate the smell. I'd say probably most people hate the smell. I kind of love it, but it reminds me of late summer, but nonetheless, it's very strong. Some of the other things you want to look for in this family are the fact that members have square stems and they have opposite leaves. So when you have the stem, you have 2 leaves on either side of the stem at the same point. However, there are other families which have square stems and opposite leaves. Think of the verbenas in the Verbenaceae or the monkey flowers in the Phrymaceae. However, both of those plants lack that really aromatic smell. So if it has the square stems, the opposite leaves, and it smells delicious, go check the mint family. That's probably where you'll find the plant that you're looking for. Notably, these also have 5 fused petals, and they're often quite ornate, like is the case with the vinegar weed or the Sonoma sage here, which looks like it has the stamens are look like antennas. It looks like an alien or a bug or something. And they have 4 stamens, 2 long and 2 short. So again, you got the 2 long stamens there, and the 2 short ones are kind of like down in the flower somewhere. In any case, that's the mint family. Okay, this one I wanted to cover, the miner's lettuce family, because I think it's really distinct. And I think people could recognize it, even though it's not quite as big as some of the other ones we've covered. The miner's lettuce family, the Montiaceae, it has typically succulent leaves, and they're often arranged in this basal whorl pattern, like this Claytonia right here, or this Louisia. It's very often in that radial kind of pattern with the succulent leaves, or this Caloptridium right here, the pussy paws, also in this family. Also, it's kind of weird because it's one of the only families I know of that has just 2 sepals. I think it might be the only one in our area with just 2 sepals, which look really cool. And this species right here, which is a rare species that occurs in our area called Cantalous Louisia, the sepals are absolutely gorgeous. They have these red glands on them. They're stunning to look at up close. A lot of the members of this family have 5 petals. Think of like the miner's lettuce. This Louisia has 5 petals, but obviously that's not a hard fast rule. So we have this other rare Louisia down here, which has many petals. I don't know, a dozen or so. The roots of many of these are tubers. Think of like a potato or something like that. Or they're otherwise thick and starchy, often thick, starchy tap roots. The fruit, it will be a capsule. So again, like a dry fruit, which opens and spills the seed out. And a lot of the members of this family have seeds with a structure called an elaiosome. And a elaiosome is like a fatty, oily appendage on the seed that ants just can't get enough of. And they will find the seeds of, say, miner's lettuce, which has this structure, bite it by the elaiosome, carry it off some distance, eat the elaiosome. And then once the elaiosome is gone, the seed is otherwise like extremely smooth and slippery. And so it can't grab the seed anymore. So that's where the seed stays. And so they've grown these structures essentially to conscript ants and to force them to spread their seeds. Okay, let's move on to the evening primrose family. And I do want to just make a quick caveat that I am saying the evening primrose family, not to be confused with the primrose family. Those are 2 different families. Evening primrose is the Onagraceae. The primrose family is the Primulaceae. But the Onagraceae has some of our more famous wildflowers, I would say, particularly our Clarkias, our furweed, California fuchsia. This is, evening primrose. Our willow herbs are in this family as well. And I think despite all the fanciful shapes and colors here, there are a couple really easy patterns to point out when it comes to this family. So most of these flowers, as you may or may not have noticed, have 4 petals. But sometimes, like is the case with this epilobium in the way upper right corner, they're lobed, and sometimes so deeply so that it gives the impression that there are actually 8 petals. But if you pull one off, you'll see at some point that it's actually lobed and not split all the way down. So 4 petals. However, the Circea, which is our enchanter's nightshade, a relatively common plant at the higher elevation. That only has 2 petals. The flowers are very, very small, but if you look close, they only have 2 petals. Often members of this family have 4-lobed stigmas. You can see that right here on the fireweed, 4 lobes, on this Clarkia, 4 lobes, 4 lobes on this epilobium. That's really common, the little cross-shaped stigma here. You can even see on this epilobium, the pollen is stuck to it. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's club-like this epilobium in the upper right. It's just like a round ball at the end rather than the 4-parted one. In members of this family, you will have 4 or 8 stamens, sometimes differing within the same genus. But Cercea, forever the drama queen, also only has 2. Has to be different. It's a very, very weird member of this family, that's Cercea. You would never guess that it actually belongs in the same family with Clarkia and epilobium and whatnot. Okay, so members of this family also have an inferior ovary. So that is, you have the petals and the sepals, and then the ovaries below it. There's 4 chambers, which almost always forms a capsule. And so it'll split open and spill out the seeds. And particularly members of the willow herbs and the fireweed, their seeds will have a hair tuft. And that hair tuft helps it, just like a dandelion fluff, helps it catch the wind and helps disperse the seeds. All right, we have another sort of alien-looking family right here, the Orobanchaceae. This is the broomrape family. I absolutely adore these plants because they look absolutely bizarre. Their ecology is super bizarre, and they're instantly recognizable, in my opinion. So plants in this family are often hairy and often glandular. So those hairs will have little glands at the tips of them, and they have most of the time brightly colored leaves. And so if you look at this Castanea right here, all this purple that you're seeing, that's actually the leaves. And then it's this little spike on the center with the little yellow parts. That's the flower itself. But all of like this Castanea above here, this red, that's all the leaves. This purple coloration on this one, just the leaves. The flowers are actually much, much smaller and much more inconspicuous, but it uses those colored leaves to attract its pollinators, which are typically, in the case of these tubular ones, like hummingbirds and things like that. These plants are fully or hemi-parasitic on other plants. So we talked earlier about parasites on fungus. Now this time, these are actually tapping into other plants. Most notably so in these 2 in the upper right. These are a phyllon species. They have no chlorophyll. They have no green. They can't make any of their own food. And so they tap into the roots of other plants. And so this little red one, I believe attacks Artemisia. And this yellow one right here, in this instance, was attacking a Phacelia species. And I just got word earlier this week that the name that we had been using for this species is, this species has been split into 2 species. And so what we're looking at right here is going to have a new name very shortly. Okay, and then the last bit is most of these have tubular flowers. So you have the tubular Castanea right here. You have the tubular phyllon right here. Or they might be pouched, like this Johnny Tuck or Butter and Eggs, whatever name you like to use for it. And even some of the Castanea have pouched flowers as well. And all of their fruits are capsules, dry fruits spilling the seeds out. All right, Polygonaceae, the knotweed family. This is a huge family in our area, mostly because it is the family which contains our wild buckwheats, our Eriogonum. And Eriogonum are probably the largest genus in California. I could be mistaken about that, but it's certainly up there. Most of the time, the flowers in this family are spikes or racemes or umbels. Think of like this, there's the spike right here of the bistort. We even have a panicle in the poke knotweed. Certainly the Persicaria has a spike as well. They're super varied though, so it's hard to really say. There's exceptions to every flower shape in this family. When you're trying to identify something in the Polygonaceae, it's very important to note the various kinds of bracts. So flowers are about equally as important as the vegetative parts. And so I did add in 2 pictures right here to just show a little bit of what I'm talking about. All the way on the bottom left, we have an Eriogonum, a wild buckwheat flower. And in this photo, we're actually showing two kinds of bracts that are good to know the difference between. You have an involucre bract, and that's these little bracts, these little tooth bits at the base of the flower. And then you have these bracts down here, and that's called the inflorescence bracts. And just knowing the difference between those two will get you very far in the Eriogonum key. And whether they're there, whether they're absent, the size of them, the shape of them, that kind of thing. And the other kind of bract that's important is the ochrea. And Eriogonum don't have ochrea, but this picture just beside it, just to the right of it, this is showing what an ochrea is. And it's essentially like a papery, membranous bit that's attached to the stem, kind of where the leaf meets the stem. And this right here is a persicaria, so it's our water smartweeds. And they have ochrea, and it's very, very important to note the shape of it. And you can see at the end, it's kind of disintegrating into these fibers here. Some species in this genus and other ones in this family, it disintegrates entirely into fibers. Sometimes it's just the end. Sometimes it falls off completely. Sometimes it lacks it entirely. But you do want to look at the stem if you really want to try to identify one of the persicarias. And I should mention an ochrea there's other families too that use that term. Caryophyllaceae is one of them. A lot of the stems have swollen nodes. So again, you're looking at like the stems. You can see a little bit of a swollen node on this poke knotweed right here. It gives them, I think that might be where the name knotweed comes from. Now that I'm thinking about it, I just put that 2 and 2 together right now. And the flowers, which you're seeing many different kinds of flowers here, these are made of variously colored sepals, but there are no petals, just sepals, no petals, which I found really interesting. And the seeds are also often triangular and winged. And so I think a good example to get an idea of what I'm talking about there is if you've ever seen sorrel, the rumex species late in the season, and they have these spikes of like almost pyramidal triangular seeds, and they have they're like light colored in the center with these darker colored wings. That's very typical Polygonaceae seed shape. All right, Ranunculaceae, we are getting close to the end here, people. So Ranunculaceae is an awesome family, in my opinion. So many different colors, so many different shapes, a lot of stuff going on with it. And I think it's a particularly interesting family because there are almost no patterns to speak of with this family. It's the only thing that I can say is that if you have a plant where there's a ton of stamens and a ton of pistils, then you should probably check this family and see if it's in the buttercup family. And a great example right here is this Caltha. These are all the stamens around the center of the flower, and these are all of the pistils in the center, just numerous. Above it right here is a Maiasaura species. This has an indeterminate carpel, is I believe the technical term for it. Essentially, this part right here is a collection of those pistils. And as long as it's able to grow, it'll just keep getting longer and longer and longer and getting pollinated over and over and over again. And you know, you're looking at this flower right here. This whole flower is maybe like 2 inches tall. And it's a member of our vernal pool community. So really, really interesting member of this family. So yeah, when I say there's no patterns, you know, a lot of them have 5 petals. But petal counts range from no petals to quote unquote many. And I say that because that's the technical term that's used in the field guides and in the Jepson manual, just many. It has many stamens, it has many pistils, but often the pistils do have hooked tips, so that helps a little bit. And just a quick example of one that has no petals is this meadow rue right here. These are just the sepals in the back. There's no petals here at all. And even this false rue anemone, these are just 5 sepals that are colored white. There's no petals at all right here. But yeah, our columbine is a member, our monkshood, our larkspurs, all a member of the Ranunculaceae. All right, and we arrive at the rose family. I feel like it would be quite easy to confuse the buttercup family and the rose family, and that's because the rose family also has many stamens and it also has many pistils. Think about like a raspberry or a blackberry. And each one of those little tiny fleshy parts of the aggregate fruit that you're looking there, each one of those is the result of a separate pistil. And they have tons of different, tons of stamens. And so I feel like it might be easy to confuse them. But one thing about the rose family is they always have 5 petals. So some members of the Ranunculaceae have 5 petals, but some have none to many. But members of the rose family, 5 petals. Although I should mention, when I give petal numbers, there can be mutations in some cases, and they may have 4 or 6, or there can be some variation. It's always good to look at more than one plant to account for those kind of things. But as you can see in all of these different flowers, at least the ones that are in flower and not in fruit, we have 5 petals in every single case. Another really important thing about this family is a stipule, and this is in other families as well, but just to define it real quick, if you look up at this rose stem in the upper right, you see this little leafy part at the base of the compound leaf. That's what we call a stipule, and it's essentially just that. It's like a leafy appendage at the base of a leaf. And like I said, other plant families have stipules as well, but they're really pronounced in several groups within the rose family. So it's good to get an eye for them. And also on this rose, we have thorns. Thorns are a very common aspect of this family between the brambles, the roses, all sorts of plants in this family have thorns. And many have edible fruits, from toyon, blackberry, thimbleberry, strawberries, all edible fruits within this family. And once again, made of several tribes. The roses and dryads and the almonds are the 3 major groups in our area, and the almonds are themselves comprised of the spireas, the plums, and the apples. So yeah, I mean, talk about edible fruits. We have plums and apples and cherries, and all of those are in this family as well. Almonds, peaches, just so many edible plants come out of the rose family. Super, super important and diverse family. And with that, I want to leave you with my closing words, which is practice, practice, practice. It's the true only way to learn to identify plants. You kind of just have to keep going at it. My advice, if this is something that interests you, is start with the plants that you already know what it is, and get yourself a good key and work backwards in the key and start to look at the characters that the key is going to ask you for. Yeah, and just keep at it. Practice really does make perfect in the case of plant ID. And with that, I want to thank you all so much. I know I just threw a ton of information at you guys. This is going to be up on our YouTube channel afterwards, so please don't hesitate to go there and rewatch it. If there's something you want to revisit, reach out to me on email, on social media. Feel free to ask me questions. I will make myself available. And with that, I will stop sharing, and maybe there have been some questions this evening. Or maybe there haven't. Yeah, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. I'd love to be able to answer anything that piqued your interest. Maybe Jean has some. Okay, Jean's got a question. Is there any field guide or reference that you recommend? Well, certainly the Redbud books. If you're in Nevada or Placer counties, the Redbud books are fantastic. I would say I can credit the Redbud books with getting me into botany. So I owe this chapter and those publications everything, as far as everything I've learned about plants in this area. I use Calflora a lot, a ton. Calflora is an invaluable resource. I collect local floras and just wait for the day that I go visit that area. I use the Jepson manual a lot, although that gets fairly technical. At the same time, it's absolutely completist. So if you're ever walking around and you're frustrated a little bit because you have a field guide which you can actually carry in the field with you comfortably, and but you're not seeing the plant that you're looking for in there, you're going to have to learn to keep plants. You're going to have to use the Jepson manual. There's really no way around it. And I find it to be an excellent resource. As far as other books go, I mean, if you really like the family focused, I recommend Botany in a Day. It was absolutely an inspiration on this talk. Just it basically teaches pattern recognition in different families. It's a little bit outdated at this point as far as the taxonomy goes, and it does cover all of North America, I believe. And so it covers a lot of information which isn't really applicable to our area, but nonetheless, it's really a really excellent book. I'd recommend that one. Oh, and I can see Nancy asked, do I think Botany in a Day is a good guide? Yes, I do. That's the answer. Okay, let's see. What is the petite pink flowered onion? Your top right in photos. Ooh, I'm gonna have to go look at my slides. Let me see if I can figure that out for you. The petite pink onion. Oh, that's Allium amplectans. Fairly common onion at the lower elevations around here. Or wait a minute, let me see. Here, let me share my screen again. Yeah, top right. Okay, no, we're good. That's Allium amplectans.
Shane, this
Yes.
is your moderator. Let me just ask a question that that probably several people have, and that is, when you talked about tribe, you'd said it was kind of an informal term that botanists use. Are there any ID elements that members of a tribe tend to have in common? I mean, is that one of the ways that botanists use this, or did they use DNA when they create the tribes? What are they using when they?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think a lot of the tribes were initially laid out before we were using genetic information, so it was very morphologically based. And I think the genetic information we've got since has either confirmed, like, yes, plants with these morphological similarities are related, in which case the tribe is basically legit, or it may have shown that the opposite. And so it really comes down to which tribe and which plants. And I'll confess that I probably don't have the knowledge without looking up the information about a specific tribe and how it would play out that way.
Sounds great. And somebody wants to know, what is the best way to contact you? They're asking for your email address, but I'm thinking that you might want another way. Oh, you put it in. Okay, great.
Yeah, go ahead. Send me an email.
Why not? There are hundreds of people out there. Okay. One of the other questions that comes up in this regard is when we look at the total number of members of a plant family and the number of members of that plant family that are found in our counties, are there patterns that we can use to help us identify which members of the species are likely to be local to these counties? Like, if we see something that we see in our yards, or if we see something in another county, can we say, oh, from looking at it, is it likely to be in our county? Or is it just you go to habitat as the answer to that question?
I'm not really sure I've understood the question. Do you mind asking it again?
Sure. I think that probably wasn't very clear. Are there patterns in terms of identifying the difference between plants in plant family and plants in the plant family that are found in our counties? like, are there patterns that are specific to the plants in our counties that tend to differentiate them, or that tend to group them together? Are they more like one another than they are like the other members of that family?
So you're saying, like, are there localized morphological similarities?
That's right.
Like,
Thank you.
okay.
Yes.
I don't think so. Except in a real broad scale, like there are certain morphological advantages that are sort of like a result of environmental factors. So like, for instance, in our area, we'll get a lot of plants that are drought adapted. They need to be drought adapted. And so the approach any given plant will take in order to deal with drought could be similar and almost convergently evolved. Like it doesn't necessarily mean that like two woolly plants, to give an example of an adaptation to drought that we see fairly commonly, are not necessarily, they're not related to each other, but both approach the same problem with the same solution, essentially.
Right. Right.
And so they're just, it's almost circumstantial and more environmental when that happens. But yeah, I mean, I can't really think of, at the same time as like that does occur, we do get such drastically different members of a certain family based on its habitat and its elevation and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it's both ultimately, but there's no correlation that I'd be able to point to anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sounds great. Somebody asks, how does it determine which plant members of the broomrate family are parasitizing?
Yeah. Okay. So the only surefire way is you dig the plant out and you see what root it's attached to. I was able to speak with authority about the yellow aphyllon that I showed because we actually, after we took that photo, we made a collection of that plant. And the reason we made a collection of that plant is the people, myself and the botanist that I was with at the time, were aware that study that I referenced was ongoing, that it was happening, that somebody was working with these plants. And so we wanted to document the fact that when we found this plant. So we made a collection, we dug it all the way down until we got a part of the root of the host plant. And then we could trace the root back to the host plant and determined it was a Phacelia. Now, in the case of the reddish one, which is a Phyllon corymbosum, I was able to determine that it was growing on Artemisia simply because I was in an Artemisia stand and there were no other plants around for it to grow on. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you want to know for sure, then you dig it out. But in most cases, I feel like you can make a pretty educated guess, or at least narrow it down. There is a sort of a finite number of potential hosts that it could possibly be on. So if you have one of those common potential hosts in the vicinity, you can probably assume that it's growing on that. And if you have a selection of those, well, then without digging it up, you can probably just say, well, it's on one of these and just go with that.
Right. I think that does bring up the point that we just want to remind people to dig something up only if it's either on your property or in private property in which you have permission from the owner to dig up something, or in your case, when you are working under contract with a governmental agency and you have permission to do this
that's right.
for official purposes. So
right, I'm always very sure to get landowner permission, and at this point, I'm now permitted as well with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and with Tahoe National Forest in order to take plants. So I have to jump through a couple hoops as far as reporting the plants that I take, but it kind of works like a fishing license in that way.
Yeah.
But ultimately now I have much more of a, it's probably the wrong word to use, but more of a carte blanche ability to collect plants and document what I see. And it's really important to document plants. I think that I will not collect a plant unless it's important to collect it. For instance, it's the first time it's been seen in our county, or it's what's called a range extension, which is like it's further out, it's further away from the habitat where we knew it to occur before. So it essentially, when you see those range maps of plants, it's an example of that plant which would change those range maps going forward. Or it's something really interesting that needs to be sort of documented, and collecting something and pressing it and putting it in an herbarium is really the only way that botany can be peer reviewed, in much like other sciences are. The next best thing is taking photos and using something like iNaturalist, which I do way more. A typical trip for me has 100 plus plants documented on iNaturalist, and maybe like one a month or something actually gets collected, because for the most part, photos suffice, and I don't have to take a plant because it's a common plant.
This gives me the opportunity to remind people that if you want to know more about how to use iNaturalist, Shane has given a talk that includes that topic, and you can find it on our Redbud YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube and look for Redbud CNPS, and then look for that particular talk.
Absolutely. You also find my virtual hikes on there if you want to go out in the woods with me.
Absolutely. It's just a wonderful way to learn more about native plants and have Shane as your guide for some of it. Alvin Ludke is with us this evening, and he has a question for you. The only reason that we're unmuting Al is because he's going to be a future presenter of Redbud CNPS in 2022, and we'll tell you more about that. Al, you have a question.
Yeah, well, I wanted to comment that iNaturalist has been a tremendous resource for me. If anybody's out there wanting to find out about ranges of plants, try iNaturalist, and you can usually find most things on iNaturalist.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you post plants anywhere locally, I will personally ID them for you. I guarantee it.
And am I right? If one is trying to figure out if something is a native or a non-native, can they also post on iNaturalist and then ask that question among others?
Yeah, you can. You could certainly ask questions in the form of a comment on iNaturalist if you wanted to know. And there's also links to various information sources as well on any given taxon page on iNaturalist. So you could just do a little bit of digging yourself too once you get an ID and find out that it is indeed native or not native.
Okay, sounds great.
And you can get help with identifications on iNaturalist. The community, often people post on iNaturalist and they say, hey, help me, what's this? Or they'll say, I think this is that. And sometimes it's wrong. Sometimes the identifications I've posted are wrong, but the community eventually gets it corrected.
That's right. Yeah, I get a lot of help with my insects on there because I do not know my insects that well, or my birds for that matter. So it's a great community of naturalists in general.
Yeah, and it's a friendly environment too. People are very supportive of each other.
Yeah, you heard it here, folks. Get on iNaturalist.
That's right. It wasn't even your comment at first. That's right. Al, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And we look forward to your talk in 2022. Do you want to give us a sentence or so about that, Al, since I've introduced you so mysteriously?
Okay. Oh, I am looking forward to it also. I wish it was a live audience, but whatever, this works. I'll be talking about the fairy moths, the genus Adela. There are more than one genus in the family, but I'll just limit my talk to the genus Adela in California, and encourage people to look for them. They're tiny little moths. There's hardly anything known about them because they've been very little studied, but they're abundant and widespread. It's a great opportunity to learn about things that are not known.
And will you be talking also about their host plants?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll be talking about, we have ovipositional photos for every described species in California. There aren't very many, only 8, but there certainly are more species that are undescribed in California. And since we have ovipositional photos of all the the described species, we know at least some of their host plants. And I talk about those relationships, and then how the moths usually have a very narrow host range, and we strongly believe that we have discovered a new species, and it was we first noticed it by associating the moth with a plant that the close related species doesn't associate with. So the plants were the clue to the moths, and then I think also the moths are the clue to the plants. The most common species, probably the most common one, will go to practically any owl's covert, but never to paintbrushes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Well, I know we all look forward to it, Al, and for everyone, we will give you more information about that in our next newsletter, as well as, of course, on our Facebook forum when the time is right, and other places where you get your Redbud CNPS information. Jean, would you like to wish everyone a good evening, or?
Hi, yes, I would. Thank you so much to everyone for attending, and I really enjoyed the talk myself. I've learned a lot, and I hope that you will come to our next presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Shane.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Had a blast.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.